I'm Jo Westbrook. I'm from the Centre for International Education at the University of Sussex, and I was PI for a rigorous review on pedagogy, curriculum, teaching practices and teacher education. And our key question is, what is the evidence on effective pedagogical practices, under what conditions and with what population of learners? So the two key issues we needed to deal with from the beginning was that we needed to get beyond labels such as student or child-centred or active learning, and therefore we looked and wanted to include studies which had a lot of real details about practices, what teachers knew and what they did, and that was very often in qualitative studies. So we had very few were in quantitative studies. And that meant that the papers came with different aims and different research methods, and therefore we couldn't directly compare across. And also we had to consider what we meant by effective. And again we took a broad brush, and that was both indicators of student learning outcomes such as greater engagement by students in a lesson, other more invisible indicators such as better attendance and community and parental approval, but also measures, which means measuring student learning outcomes either by a standardised test or by some national data. So we use both indicators and measures. So it boiled down to 45 papers from a wide range of countries. Most of the students there were from disadvantaged areas, marginalised children and girls, so that our findings pertain to those particular kind of children. There were three particular aspects that came across strongly, or relatively strongly, from studies reporting positive outcomes, and they were attitudes, strategies and practices. Teachers' positive attitudes towards their training and their students was very important, but that was important because it shaped the way in which they enacted three overarching strategies that were communicative by nature. And those three strategies were teachers giving feedback and paying inclusive attention to students, and that came out relatively strongly. The other two, less strong but certainly present, were teachers creating a safe environment for their students to learn in, and that often meant withholding corporal punishment and any threat of violence. And thirdly, drawing on their students' background and experiences, and so making the content meaningful and accessible. So those were interactive or communicative in nature, and those in turn interacted on 6 practices that came up commonly across this body of evidence. The 4 practices which came out slightly stronger than the rest were teachers using group and pair work in particular ways, teachers using good learning materials and going beyond just replicating or regurgitating the textbook, teachers using open and closed questioning and asking for students to respond and having wait time and asking students to ask questions, and teachers planning their lesson, so they had a variety of different structures to their lesson. They didn't just vary it. And 2 other ones, with slightly weaker evidence, were teachers drawing on strong content knowledge in order to explain or get over a concept, and also using local language and code switching. So those were attitudes and strategies and practices. And conversely, the body of evidence also showed that those practices, the same practices that came up, could also be implemented poorly if they were devoid of this communicative aspect. so that we had actually in the end an almost equal body of evidence saying, look, this, if you ask questioning in a communicative way, then you'll get a good response. But if you also ask questioning but just fire off a quick number of questions without bothering to wait to see if students would really respond, then that practice is not so effective. There were also facilitating factors and barriers to teachers implementing these effective practices, and that came from looking at teacher education and the curriculum. What came out strongly out of papers touching on those was the importance of teacher peer support, and that had a larger number of studies where teachers felt supported to implement these pedagogies from colleagues or within a school cluster. Other facilitating factors were where the pedagogical, the input or the training given matched the kind of pedagogy that was supposed to be used. So if you're using a child-centred pedagogy as a teacher, the way that you're trained to use it is not just by lecture. Also, whether the curriculum was accessible and appropriately pitched, and where the assessment of the school curriculum matched what the teachers had to do, and also the importance of head teacher and community support. Amongst the barriers, the overriding barrier, perhaps not surprisingly, for teachers to be effective was lack of learning materials and very large classes. That came through a very large number of studies, but also where, again conversely, there was misalignment between the training the teachers were given and what they were supposed to deliver. So the evidence base itself is moderate and with a very large number of very different papers, but there was consistency in what the studies reported, both negative findings and positive outcomes. As we said, most of the papers were qualitative. There were three papers that tried to correlate teacher characteristics and practices with directly with what students were learning, and those were included, and they give greater robustness. But that also leads us to look at the research gaps. In terms of the research gaps, there was a need for larger scale mixed methods studies using baseline and post-test ways of measuring student attainment, as well as giving details of the practices and also including student perspectives on their learning. There were research gaps in seeing what effective practices were used with very large classes, and also effective pedagogies for use with children with disabilities, those in multi-grade classes and students who are over age, and examples of curricula designed for very specific groups where the curriculum had perhaps been revised, but also teachers' use of assessment in relation to the curriculum.